How could an army forged in the crucible of the American Revolution, an army that had humbled the most powerful empire on earth, be utterly annihilated by a force its commanders publicly derided as a disorganized rabble of savages? And what are we to make of the unsettling whispers from the archives, the ghost of a document, a meticulously detailed plan of the attack, allegedly penned by a British officer nearly 2 years before the battle ever took place? The story of the Battle of the Wabash is not merely a tale of defeat. It is a chilling testament to a nation's hubris, a chronicle of a victory so total it shattered one army and, in doing so, forged another. It is the story of the day the earth drank the blood of 1,000 soldiers, the day the Ohio frontier earned its name as the Dark and Bloody Ground. In 1791, the United States of America was a young, swaggering nation convinced of its own divinely ordained destiny. Its gaze was fixed westward upon the vast, fertile expanse of the Ohio country, a land promised to its soldiers, coveted by its speculators, and seen as the natural inheritance of a new republic. The only obstacle was the land's inhabitants, a confederation of peoples who had lived there for centuries, who saw the unending tide of white settlers not as pioneers, but as an existential threat. The ink on the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War in 1783, was barely dry, yet its promises were already turning to ash in the mouths of the Native American leaders. Great Britain had ceded all lands east of the Mississippi to the new United States, a grand gesture made without consulting or even informing their own native allies who had fought and bled alongside them. To the Shawnee, the Miami, the Delaware, the Wyandot, the Ottawa, and others, this was the ultimate betrayal. Their land, their homes, their very existence had been signed away by a distant king. The American government under President George Washington saw the matter with a lawyer's cold clarity. The tribes had sided with the losing side, therefore their lands were forfeit by right of conquest. Treaties were signed, such as the Treaty of Fort McIntosh, but they were documents of coercion, signed by minor chiefs or those with no authority, ceding millions of acres for pennies and promises. The Republic wanted to buy a continent with glass beads, but the continent was preparing to present its bill in blood. The Ohio River became the line, not of demarcation, but of confrontation. A river of blood, the settlers called it, as native raiding parties struck with brutal efficiency at the flatboats and isolated cabins of the encroaching Kentuckians, whom they called the Long Knives. The Americans, for their part, responded with their own brand of terror. Militias, often little more than armed mobs, launched punitive expeditions, burning villages and fields, killing indiscriminately. It was a cycle of violence, a perpetual motion machine of hatred and retribution. But from this chaos, a new kind of unity was being forged among the tribes. For generations they had been rivals, competing for resources and influence. Now they faced a common enemy whose appetite for land was seemingly infinite. A leader emerged, a man of quiet brilliance and strategic genius, Little Turtle, or Misikinakwa, a war chief of the Miami people. He was not a man of fiery speeches, but of cold, hard logic. He understood that disunity meant death. Alongside him rose Blue Jacket, the formidable Shawnee war chief, a charismatic and ferocious warrior who could inspire men to follow him into the heart of the fire. Together they began to weave together the disparate threads of tribal resistance into a formidable tapestry, a Western Indian confederacy dedicated to a single, unalterable principle: the Ohio River would be the permanent boundary. No more treaties, no more land cessions. The federal government in the temporary capital of Philadelphia watched this growing storm with a mixture of annoyance and arrogance. The reports from the frontier were troubling, but the men in power, men like Secretary of War Henry Knox, were veterans of the Continental Army. They had faced down British regulars and Hessian mercenaries. They could not conceive that a collection of what they considered undisciplined warriors could pose a serious threat to the authority of the United States. They decided a show of force was necessary, a quick, sharp lesson to pacify the region. In 1790, President Washington authorized a campaign under the command of Brigadier General Josiah Harmar. It was a disaster. Hamar's army, a poorly trained mix of federal troops and unreliable militia, marched into the heart of the Confederacy's territory, burned a few abandoned villages, and was twice lured into devastating ambushes by Little Turtle's forces. They limped back to Fort Washington in disgrace, having lost nearly 200 men and accomplished nothing but hardening the resolve of the native warriors. Philadelphia was stunned, then humiliated. The defeat was an insult to the nation's honor. Washington and Knox knew that the next expedition had to be larger, more powerful, and decisive. They needed a commander who could crush the Confederacy once and for all. Their choice would set the stage for the greatest military catastrophe in the nation's history. Was the conflict that followed an unavoidable clash of civilizations, a tragic collision of two peoples destined to vie for the same land? Or was it the result of deliberate choices, a tragedy born not of fate, but of greed and arrogance? If you had been a leader in that era, faced with the pressures of a new nation and the rights of the land's ancient inhabitants, would you have prioritized the sanctity of treaties or the promise of expansion? Let your voice be heard in the comments below. The humiliation of Hamar's defeat echoed through the halls of Congress Hall in Philadelphia, a sour note in the triumphant symphony of the new republic. The federal government, still finding its footing, could not afford to look weak. It could not allow its authority to be challenged by what its leaders saw as a minor frontier nuisance. The response had to be overwhelming, a demonstration of power so absolute that it would extinguish the flames of resistance in the Ohio country forever. The man chosen to deliver this thunderous message was Major General Arthur St. Clair. On paper, he seemed an impeccable choice. He was a distinguished veteran of the Revolutionary War, having served at Trenton and Princeton. He had been a president of the Continental Congress. He was currently the governor of the Northwest Territory itself. He was a man of stature, a political heavyweight, but the St. Clair of 1791 was not the vigorous officer of the Revolution. He was 63 years old, overweight, and tormented by crippling attacks of gout, a condition so severe it often left him unable to walk or even ride a horse, forcing him to be carried on a litter like a wounded potentate. He was a politician, a bureaucrat, more comfortable behind a desk than in a saddle. He was a man ill-suited for the rigors of a wilderness campaign, a fact that would have fatal consequences. His task was monumental: to raise, equip, and lead a new army into the heart of enemy territory and build a chain of forts to secure American dominance. The problem was the army he was given to command. It was, in almost every respect, an army of ghosts and amateurs. Congress, wary of the expense and the political danger of a large standing army, had authorized a force of regulars, the 1st and 2nd United States regiments, but these were skeletal units, undermanned and scattered. The bulk of St. Clair's force would have to be raised from scratch. Recruiters were sent out with fifes, drums, and promises of pay and land, but the caliber of men they attracted was abysmal. The pool of patriotic veterans from the Revolution had long since returned to their farms. The men who signed on for St. Clair's campaign were, as one officer lamented, the offscourings of large towns and cities. They were beggars, drunkards, petty criminals, and desperate immigrants who barely spoke English. They were men with nothing to lose, lured by the prospect of $3 a month. Discipline was non-existent, drunkenness was rampant, desertion a daily occurrence. Fights were common, and the lash was applied liberally, but with little effect. These were not soldiers, they were the raw, unwilling material of a military disaster. If the men were poor, their equipment was even worse. The logistical chain was a masterpiece of corruption and incompetence. The Quartermaster General's department was a shambles run by men who saw the campaign not as a national duty, but as a personal opportunity for profit. Contracts were awarded to the lowest bidders, who delivered shoddy goods at inflated prices. The tents leaked, turning the camps into muddy quagmires. The axes were so soft they bent when struck against hardwood trees. The gunpowder was of poor quality, reducing the range and stopping power of the muskets. The soldiers' shoes fell apart after a few weeks of marching. Most critically, the food supply was a catastrophe. Salt beef arrived packed in brine so weak it was already spoiling. Flour was infested with weevils. The The men were constantly hungry, sick, and demoralized. This was not an army marching to war. It was a funeral procession shuffling towards its own grave, and every officer with a shred of experience knew it. The march from Fort Washington near modern-day Cincinnati began in the late summer of 1791. It was an agonizingly slow crawl into the wilderness. The army had to carve its own road through the dense primeval forest of Ohio, a land of massive trees, thick undergrowth, and sucking swamps. The progress was measured in a few miserable miles per day. The autumn rains began, turning the crude track into a river of mud that swallowed wagons and exhausted the draft animals. The men, already weakened by poor nutrition, began to fall ill with influenza, dysentery, and pneumonia. The cold set in, and the summer weight uniforms offered little protection. The camp followers, a collection of wives, laundresses, and prostitutes who accompanied the army, added to the logistical burden and the general chaos. St. Clair, often prostrate with gout, struggled to maintain control. His second in command, General Richard Butler, was a brave but contentious officer who frequently clashed with his superior. The militia, mostly ill-disciplined Kentuckians, despised the regulars and chafed under any semblance of military order. They were the first to desert, sometimes in entire companies, leaving the army weaker with each passing day. A deep sense of foreboding settled over the entire expedition. They were marching deeper and deeper into a land that did not want them, a land whose unseen defenders were watching their every move. The generals in their powdered wigs drew maps in their tents, not understanding that on that land the real lines were being drawn by tomahawks. The fate of this doomed army was not sealed on the morning of the battle, but in the months of mismanagement, corruption, and neglect that preceded it. It was an army defeated long before the first shot was fired, a fact known to everyone except, it seemed, the men in charge in Philadelphia. The lumbering, sickly column was a perfect target, a lamb being led to a slaughter designed by military minds far sharper than those of its own commanders. While Arthur St. Clair's pathetic army slogged through the Ohio mud, a very different kind of force was gathering in the deep woods. This was not a conscripted mob, but a coalition of proud warriors fighting for their homes, their families, and their way of life. The Western Indian Confederacy was reaching the zenith of its power, a remarkable political and military achievement orchestrated by leaders of extraordinary skill. At the heart of this alliance were the two towering figures of Little Turtle and Blue Jacket. They were a study in contrasts, a perfect fusion of mind and muscle. Little Turtle, the Miami chief, was the strategist, the cool and calculating intellect of the Confederacy. He possessed a profound understanding of terrain, logistics, and enemy psychology. He had studied the white man's way of war, recognizing both its strengths and its critical weaknesses. It was he who had masterminded the ambushes that had cut Hamar's army to pieces, and now he was preparing a far grander trap for St. Clair. He was a visionary who saw that only through unity could the tribes hope to survive the American onslaught. He spent months engaged in tireless diplomacy, traveling between villages, persuading, cajoling, and reminding the chiefs of the magnitude of the threat they all faced. He argued that old rivalries must be set aside for the sake of their collective existence. Blue Jacket, the Shawnee chief, was the Confederacy's spirit of war. He was a magnetic and fearless warrior, a man whose physical presence alone commanded respect. Where Little Turtle was cerebral, Blue Jacket was visceral. He could stir the hearts of warriors with his speeches, reminding them of the injustices they had suffered, the sacredness of their lands, and the glory of dying in its defense. He was the embodiment of resistance, a leader who led from the front, his war cry a signal of impending death for his enemies. Together, they formed a leadership team that perfectly balanced strategy with inspiration. They were joined by other formidable chiefs like Bucongahelas of the Delaware and Tahe of the Wyandot. This was no simple war party. It was a grand council of nations, a united front that the Americans, in their cultural blindness, could not begin to comprehend. They saw only savages, failing to recognize the sophisticated political and military machine arrayed against them. The Confederacy's greatest asset was its intelligence network. Their scouts and hunters moved through the forest like phantoms, shadowing St. Clair's army from the moment it left Fort Washington. They were the eyes and ears of Little Turtle, providing him with daily updates on the army's size, its snail-like pace, its route, and its deplorable condition. They noted the lack of discipline, the poor security, the vulnerability of the lumbering column. Little Turtle knew everything. He knew the number of cannons, the sickness in the camps, the desertion of the militia. He knew St. Clair was marching his army into a coffin of its own making. Based on this flawless intelligence, he and the other chiefs devised a plan of brilliant simplicity and deadly effectiveness. They would not engage the army on the march. They would wait. They would let it exhaust itself, let the cold and sickness do their work. They would allow it to penetrate deep into their territory, far from any hope of reinforcement. Then they would choose the time and place of the battle, a place where the terrain itself would become their greatest ally. They would wait for the army to make camp in an exposed, indefensible position. Then, under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness, they would encircle it completely and attack from all sides at once, creating a ring of fire from which there could be no escape. The plan was not just to defeat the American army, but to annihilate it, to erase it from the face of the earth as a warning to the greedy republic. The spiritual leaders of the tribes played a crucial role, invoking visions and prophecies of a great victory that would drive the white man back across the Ohio forever. This imbued the warriors with a powerful sense of destiny and a fanatic courage. They were not just soldiers, they were instruments of a higher purpose, defenders of a sacred trust. As St. Clair's miserable troops huddled in their leaky tents, cursing their fate, the warriors of the Confederacy gathered, their faces painted for war, their weapons sharpened, their spirits steeled. They were a force united by a common cause, led by brilliant commanders, and utterly confident in the outcome of the coming battle. The contrast could not have been more stark. One army was a body without a soul, the other was a soul on fire. The stage was set for a collision, but it would not be a battle, it would be a reckoning. The ground itself seemed to be waiting, hungry for the blood it was about to receive on the banks of the Wabash River. The 3rd of November, 1791, was a day of weary relief for the American army. After weeks of brutal marching, General St. Clair called a halt on the eastern bank of the Wabash River, near the future site of Fort Recovery, Ohio. The location was poorly chosen, a flat, low-lying piece of ground with little natural defense, surrounded by dense woods that rose slightly on all sides, a perfect amphitheater for an ambush. But the men were exhausted, and this spot had access to water. The decision was made. The camp was laid out in a sprawling, disorganized fashion. The militia, some 300 strong, was sent across the river, about a quarter of a mile ahead of the main body, to serve as a token forward picket. No significant fortifications were erected, no trenches dug, no abatis of felled trees constructed. A few sentries were posted, but they huddled close to their fires against the biting cold of the late autumn night. A profound and inexplicable complacency settled over the camp. Despite being deep in hostile territory, despite the recent humiliation of Hamar's expedition, the army behaved as if it were on a training exercise. St. Clair and his officers seemed to believe that the native forces would never dare to mount a full-scale assault on such a large body of troops. It was a fatal miscalculation, a failure of imagination born of arrogance. As the 1,400 soldiers and camp followers settled in for the night, another army was completing its final silent maneuvers. More than 1,000 warriors, led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, had slipped into position, forming a vast crescent-shaped line that enveloped the American camp. They moved with the quiet discipline of predators, melting into the shadows of the forest. They were a diverse force: Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, Pottawatomie, Wyandotte, Ottawa, united in a single purpose. Each warrior knew the plan. The attack would begin just before sunrise, the moment of deepest cold and lowest visibility, when the enemy would be at their most vulnerable. The first assault would crash into the militia camp, driving the panicked survivors back into the main encampment to sow chaos and confusion. Then, the main body of warriors would rise as one and pour a devastating fire into the huddled mass of soldiers from all sides. The objective was simple: total annihilation. The night passed in an uneasy quiet. The moon cast a pale, ghostly light over the frost-covered tents. For the American soldiers, it was just another miserable night in a long, miserable campaign. For the warriors hidden in the trees, it was the eve of their great reckoning. They waited with a patience that was, in itself, a weapon. The dawn of November 4th arrived grey and frigid. A thin mist hung over the river. The soldiers were just beginning to stir, the first cookfires sending wisps of smoke into the still air. The army had been paraded under arms before dawn, a standard precautionary measure, but with no sign of danger, the men were dismissed from the ranks to prepare their breakfast. It was in this moment of relaxation, this brief window of vulnerability, that hell was unleashed. A single rifle shot cracked the morning silence, then another. Then a terrifying chorus erupted from the woods across the river, the blood-curdling, high-pitched war cry of 1,000 warriors. The attack on the militia camp was instantaneous and overwhelming. The Kentuckians, caught completely by surprise, barely had time to grab their weapons. They fired a single, ragged volley before breaking in terror. They abandoned their positions and fled for their lives, streaming back across the shallow river and crashing into the main camp, a human wave of panic. They were not just retreating, they were a vector of chaos, shouting that the enemy was upon them, that they were outnumbered, that all was lost. Their flight served Little Turtle's plan perfectly, disrupting the regulars before they could even form proper battle lines. The warriors were right behind them, fording the river and pressing the attack with relentless ferocity. Simultaneously, the main body of the Confederacy's forces, the Horns of the Great Crescent, rose from their concealed positions around the main camp and opened fire. A storm of lead and arrows ripped through the tents and tore into the bodies of the soldiers who were still struggling to comprehend what was happening. The surprise was total. The camp became a slaughterhouse in seconds. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the din of gunfire and screaming. Soldiers fumbled to load their muskets, many falling before they could fire a single shot. The collapse of command and control was immediate and absolute. The perfectly conceived ambush had worked with flawless, deadly precision. In those first few minutes, the battle was already lost. The only question that remained was how many would die before the end. In a moment of absolute terror, when discipline shatters and the chain of command ceases to exist, what primal force takes over? Is it the instinct for survival, the desperate, selfish need to flee at any cost? Or is it the ingrained duty to stand and fight, a final act of courage against impossible odds? Share your thoughts on which impulse you believe is stronger in the human spirit. The chaos unleashed by the routed militia was the spark that ignited the inferno. The main American camp, a confused jumble of tents, baggage wagons and panicked men, became the epicenter of the slaughter. The warriors of the Confederacy, masters of woodland warfare, remained almost entirely invisible. They fought from behind the cover of trees and fallen logs, pouring a precise and murderous fire into the exposed ranks of the regular soldiers. The Americans, drilled in the European style of linear warfare, were tragically unprepared for this kind of fighting. Their officers, models of suicidal bravery, tried to rally their men into formation, to stand shoulder to shoulder in the open and trade volleys with an enemy they could not see. It was a tactic designed for the fields of Europe, and in the forests of Ohio, it was mass suicide. The soldiers fell in droves. The smoke from the black powder hung thick and low in the cold morning air, mixing with the mist to create a suffocating, disorienting fog. Through this grey pall, the only clear images were the muzzle flashes from the trees and the terrifying sight of warriors, their faces painted in fearsome designs, darting from cover to cover to finish off the wounded with a tomahawk or scalping knife. The warriors had been instructed to specifically target the officers, who were easily identifiable by their uniforms and swords. They were picked off with chilling efficiency. Colonel William Oldham of the Kentucky militia was one of the first to fall. General Richard Butler, St. Clair's second-in-command, fought with incredible courage, attempting to rally the men despite being wounded. He was carried to the center of the camp, where he was shot again and then killed and scalped while a surgeon attended to his wounds. The systematic elimination of the officer corps decapitated the army, leaving the enlisted men leaderless and adrift in a sea of terror. Despite the hopelessness of their situation, pockets of the regular army fought back with desperate courage. Several times, under the command of the few remaining officers, they managed to form ragged lines and mount bayonet charges into the woods. The warriors would simply melt away before the advance, letting the soldiers charge into the empty forest, only to close in on their flanks and rear as they tried to retreat, cutting them to pieces. The charges achieved nothing but to exhaust the men and increase the body count. The American artillery, which the commanders had hoped would be a decisive weapon, was rendered almost useless. The gunners were exposed targets, picked off before they could effectively service their pieces. Several cannons were fired, but their shots crashed harmlessly into the massive trees. Soon, warriors swarmed the artillery positions, capturing the guns and turning them against the Americans, though they lacked the knowledge to operate them effectively. The sound of the battle was a symphony of hell, the constant crackle of musketry, the boom of the useless cannons, the war cries of the attackers, and the screams of the wounded and dying. Panic turned to sheer terror. Discipline evaporated completely. Soldiers abandoned their weapons and tried to hide behind wagons or among the bodies of their fallen comrades. It was a complete psychological collapse. In the center of this maelstrom were the camp followers. Nearly 200 women, wives, laundresses, cooks, and an unknown number of children had accompanied the army. They were caught in the heart of the slaughter with no means of defense. Their terror was unimaginable. Some tried to hide in wagons only to be discovered and killed. Others ran screaming through the camp, cut down by the indiscriminate fire. The warriors, seeing them as part of the invading force, showed them no mercy. The killing of the women and children added a particular layer of horror to a day already defined by it. General St. Clair himself displayed a desperate, pathetic courage. He was still suffering from gout and had to be helped onto his horse. He rode back and forth behind what was left of the lines, trying to shout orders that no one could hear over the noise, trying to impose a semblance of order on a situation that was utterly out of control. He was a perfect target, yet he seemed to lead a charmed life. 8 bullets ripped through his clothing and his hat. One horse was killed beneath him, then another. But he remained physically unscathed, a helpless witness to the complete and total destruction of his army. The crescent of fire had closed into a circle, and within that circle, the United States Army was being systematically exterminated. There was no longer any hope of victory or even of organized resistance. The only instinct left was the most primal one: escape. After nearly 3 hours of relentless slaughter, what was left of the American army had been compressed into a small, terrified huddle around the baggage and tents in the center of the camp. They were surrounded, leaderless, and being cut down from all sides. The ground was slick with blood and littered with the dead and dying. The wounded screamed for help that would never come. It was clear to St. Clair and the few surviving officers that to remain was to ensure the death of every last man. The only conceivable option, however remote, was to attempt a breakout. The order was given to abandon everything: the wounded, the cannons, the supplies, the tents, and to punch a hole through the enemy line and flee. It was a desperate gamble, a signal of utter defeat. A mass of the most able-bodied men, perhaps a few hundred of them, formed a crude wedge and charged the southeastern side of the warriors' circle, the direction of the road back to Fort Jefferson. The warriors, surprised by the sudden concentrated push and more interested in the rich plunder of the camp, briefly gave way. A gap was opened. Through it poured the panicked survivors, a frantic, disorganized mob. The retreat began. But this was not an orderly withdrawal. It was a rout, a mad stampede for safety. Soldiers threw away their muskets and cartridge boxes to lighten their load, running for their lives with the war cries of their pursuers echoing behind them. The breakout from the camp was not an escape. It was merely the beginning of the next phase of the massacre. The 29-mile road back to Fort Jefferson became a Via Dolorosa, a road of 1,000 corpses. The warriors of the Confederacy, having secured the camp and its immense spoils, took up the pursuit. They were fresh, masters of their own terrain, and they ran down the exhausted, terrified soldiers with ease. The flight was a harrowing, miles-long running battle. Any man who stumbled, who was too slow, or who was wounded was quickly overtaken and dispatched with a tomahawk. The warriors, their bloodlust running high, showed no mercy. The road and the surrounding woods were strewn with the bodies of American soldiers. The trail of the rout was easy to follow, marked by a grim litter of abandoned equipment, muskets, knapsacks, canteens, and the corpses of men who had been a part of the United States Army only hours before. The psychological collapse was as complete as the military one. The survivors were no longer soldiers. They were animals, fleeing a predator, driven by pure terror. They ran until they could run no more, their lungs burning, their minds numb with horror. A small number of the first and fastest fugitives reached Fort Jefferson late in the afternoon, their wild-eyed appearance and incoherent stories providing the first news of the catastrophe. They were specters of defeat, their faces blackened with powder, their uniforms in tatters. Throughout the evening and into the night, more survivors trickled in ones and twos, each with his own tale of horror, each confirming the unbelievable scale of the disaster. Back at the site of the battle, the victorious warriors walked among the dead. The plunder was beyond their wildest dreams. They found thousands of muskets, dozens of cannons, huge quantities of gunpowder and ammunition, tents, blankets, tools, and officers' fine uniforms and swords. For a people who were often poorly supplied, it was a staggering windfall. The camp was a scene of grotesque celebration and grim finality. The bodies of the American dead were scalped and mutilated. Some reports claimed that the mouths of the dead soldiers were stuffed with soil, a symbolic gesture to mock their insatiable hunger for land. The exact number of American casualties would never be known with certainty. But the estimates were horrific. Out of an army of roughly 1,400, at least 632 soldiers were killed, with another 264 wounded. The number of dead camp followers pushed the total fatalities to well over 900. It was and remains the highest casualty rate, over 97% of those engaged in the main fight ever suffered by a United States military force in a single engagement. The Confederacy's losses, by contrast, were shockingly light, an estimated 21 killed and 40 wounded. It was not just a victory, it was one of the most lopsided military triumphs in the history of warfare. The news of this catastrophe, carried by exhausted messengers, began its slow journey eastward toward the capital in Philadelphia, where a president and a nation were about to be plunged into a state of shock and disbelief. The news of the disaster on the Wabash did not arrive in Philadelphia with a single dramatic thunderclap. It came as a series of increasingly grim whispers carried by exhausted express riders who had pushed their horses to the breaking point. The first fragmented reports spoke of a difficult engagement, a tactical withdrawal. But as more complete accounts arrived in December of 1791, the terrible truth could no longer be denied or softened. An entire American army had been effectively erased. The capital of the United States, a city buzzing with the energy and optimism of a new nation, was plunged into a state of collective shock and mourning. The casualty lists were published in the newspapers, sending waves of grief through every level of society. President George Washington was hosting a dinner party at his residence on Market Street when a mud-spattered officer arrived with the official dispatch from the frontier. Washington maintained his legendary composure throughout the evening, a mask of presidential calm. But later that night, alone with his private secretary, Tobias Lear, the facade shattered. According to Lear's account, Washington began to pace the room in a state of agitation, his temper finally erupting in a volcanic fury. "It's all over! St. Clair's defeated. Routed! The officers nearly all killed, the men by wholesale." He raged. He cursed St. Clair, screaming, "Oh God! Oh God, he's worse than a murderer!" How can he answer it to his country? It was a rare glimpse of the raw, volcanic passion that lay beneath Washington's stoic exterior, the fury of a commander-in-chief who felt the loss of every single soldier as a personal failure and a national humiliation. The public reaction was one of outrage. The newspapers, a vibrant and partisan force in the young republic, were filled with scathing editorials and letters demanding to know how such a catastrophe could have happened. Who was to blame? Was it the commanding general, the Secretary of War, or the corrupt contractors? The very foundations of the new federal government were shaken. This was its first major test since the adoption of the Constitution, and it appeared to be a catastrophic failure. The defeat emboldened the critics of the Washington administration, those who feared the power of a centralized government and a standing army. They argued that the disaster was the inevitable result of federal overreach and military adventurism. The pressure for a public accounting was immense. In response, the House of Representatives took an unprecedented step. In March of 1792, it established a special committee to investigate the causes of the St. Clair expedition's failure. This was the first ever congressional investigation in the history of the United States, a landmark moment that would establish the power of Congress to oversee the executive branch. The committee, chaired by Representative Thomas Fitzsimons of Pennsylvania, was granted the power to call for such persons, papers, and records as may be necessary to assist their inquiries. When the committee formally requested the administration's papers related to the campaign, it precipitated the nation's first great constitutional crisis. President Washington convened his cabinet, including Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph, to decide how to respond. The cabinet unanimously concluded that the executive branch had the right to withhold information if its disclosure would injure the public good. This was the birth of the doctrine of executive privilege, a concept that would echo through centuries of American political conflict. While Washington ultimately chose to cooperate and turn over the requested documents, the principle had been established. The investigation itself became a political firestorm. General Street, Clair returned to Philadelphia to defend his honor. He demanded a court-martial to clear his name, but there were not enough surviving officers of his rank to convene one. He instead presented his case to the Congressional Committee, arguing that he had been let down by the Quartermaster's Department, the poor quality of his troops, and the government's failure to provide adequate resources. The committee's final report largely exonerated St. Clair personally, placing the primary blame on the War Department, specifically on the Quartermaster and the contractors, for the logistical failures and shoddy equipment that had doomed the expedition from the start. Despite this, Arthur St. Clair's public career was ruined. He resigned his military commission, though he remained governor of the Northwest Territory for several more years. He became the face of the defeat, a symbol of national humiliation, and he would spend the rest of his life in poverty and obscurity, trying in vain to restore his reputation. The political shockwaves of the battle had established powerful new precedents for American governance, but for the nation, the sting of defeat was a wound that would demand a reckoning. When a national disaster strikes, a failure of this magnitude, where does the ultimate responsibility lie? Is it with the field commander who makes the tactical errors on the day of battle, or with the political leadership that creates the conditions for failure through neglect, corruption, and poor planning? Let us know in the comments who you believe bears the greater blame. While the politicians in Philadelphia were consumed with finger-pointing and constitutional debates, a very different scene was unfolding in the villages along the Maumee River. The victorious warriors of the Western Confederacy had returned to their homes as heroes. The celebration was immense, a cathartic release after years of encroachment and warfare. They had achieved the impossible. They had met the army of the United States in open battle and had not just defeated it, but had utterly destroyed it. The spoils of war were staggering. The the warriors now possessed hundreds of military-grade muskets, ammunition, tents, blankets, and even several cannons. The victory infused the Confederacy with an intoxicating sense of power and invincibility. It seemed to confirm the prophecies of their spiritual leaders that with unity and resolve, they could drive the Americans back across the Ohio River for good. The British agents at their nearby forts, like Fort Detroit, offered congratulations and continued their tacit support, providing trade goods and weapons while carefully avoiding any official military alliance. To the more militant chiefs, particularly Blue Jacket and the Shawnee, the path forward was clear. Now was the time to press their advantage, to launch a series of raids to cleanse the land of the hated Long Knives. They believed that the United States, humbled and broken, might now finally be willing to accept the Ohio River as a permanent boundary. However, beneath the surface of this triumphant unity, the seeds of future defeat were already beginning to sprout. The strategic genius behind the victory, the Miami chief Little Turtle, viewed the situation with a far more sober and prescient eye. He understood the Americans better than most of his counterparts. He knew that this humiliating defeat would not cause them to retreat. On the contrary, he rightly predicted it would enrage them, that it would galvanize their will, and that they would return, not with another army of amateurs, but with a force of trained, disciplined, and vengeful killers. Little Turtle argued that the victory, as magnificent as it was, had given the Confederacy a fleeting moment of maximum leverage. This, he contended, was the perfect time to negotiate a peace from a position of strength to secure the Ohio boundary through a treaty that the humbled Americans might now be willing to honor. His was a voice of pragmatic caution in a council swept up in the euphoria of victory. The debate that followed created the first serious fissure within the Confederacy's leadership. Blue Jacket and the majority of the chiefs saw Little Turtle's counsel as a form of weakness, even cowardice. They accused him of wanting to throw away the fruits of their great triumph. Had they not just proven that their warriors were superior to the American soldiers? Why sue for peace when total victory seemed within their grasp? The Confederacy's greatest victory had created its most dangerous delusion, the myth of its own invincibility. The chiefs, drunk on success, overestimated their own strength and critically underestimated the resilience and industrial capacity of the United States. They failed to grasp that they had destroyed an army, but they had not broken a nation. In fact, they had done the opposite. They had awakened a sleeping giant and filled it with a terrible resolve. The British, their supposed allies, were another source of false hope. They encouraged the Confederacy's resistance as a useful buffer state to protect their Canadian territories and fur trade interests, but London had no intention of being drawn into another full-scale war with the United States over the Ohio country. Their support was a mile wide and an inch deep. At the decisive moment, they would provide no real help, a betrayal that would later prove fatal. And so the Confederacy made its tragic choice. It rejected Little Turtle's call for diplomacy and chose to continue the war, confident that any future American army would meet the same fate as St. Clair's. It was a decision born of pride and a misreading of their enemy's character. The triumph on the Wabash, the single greatest victory of Native Americans over the United States military, had paradoxically sealed their doom. It ensured that the next American army to march north would be an instrument not of policy, but of pure, cold revenge. The news of St. Clair's defeat did more than just shock and humiliate the United States. It served as a brutal but necessary education. It exposed the fatal weakness of the nation's military posture, which had relied on a tiny corps of regulars supplemented by ill-disciplined and unreliable state militias. President Washington, a military man to his core, knew that this model had failed catastrophically. The nation could not survive on the frontier if it could not project credible force. The debate in Congress was fierce. The anti-federalists railed against the cost and the tyrannical potential of a professional standing army. But the bloody reality of the Wabash massacre was an undeniable argument. The nation had a choice: either abandon the West or create an army capable of conquering it. The decision was made. Out of the ashes of St. Clair's command, a new military force would be born. Congress authorized the creation of a new, expanded, and reorganized army officially titled the Legion of the United States. This was a radical departure. The Legion was not to be a collection of disparate regiments, but a single, integrated fighting force of over 5,000 men, divided into 4 sub-legions. Each sub-legion was a combined arms unit containing infantry, riflemen, dragoons, and artillery. It was designed for flexibility and power, America's first truly professional standing army. An army, however well designed, is only as good as its commander. Washington knew he needed a new kind of general, one who was the polar opposite of the gout-ridden, bureaucratically minded Arthur St. Clair. He needed a fighter, a disciplinarian, a man whose aggression was matched by his meticulous planning. He chose Major General Anthony Wayne. The choice was inspired. Wayne had earned the moniker Mad Anthony during the Revolution, not for any insanity, but for his tactical audacity and fierce, almost reckless, courage in battle. But behind the fiery reputation was a shrewd and methodical commander who understood the importance of discipline, training, and logistics, precisely the areas where the St. Clair expedition had failed. Wayne embraced his new command with a grim determination. He would not repeat the mistakes of the past. He established a new training camp at Legionville, downriver from Pittsburgh, a location deliberately chosen to be far from the corrupting influences of the city's taverns and brothels. There, he forged the Legion into a fearsome fighting machine. The discipline was iron, the training was relentless and brutal, designed to harden the men and prepare them specifically for the challenges of woodland warfare. Wayne drilled his soldiers endlessly in marksmanship, open-order fighting, and the use of the bayonet. He taught them to load and fire on the move, to take cover, and to respond instantly to bugle commands. He ran them through exhausting maneuvers, building their physical endurance. He weeded out incompetent officers and mercilessly punished drunkenness and desertion. His men may have hated his methods, but they learned to respect him and, more importantly, to trust him. He also paid painstaking attention to logistics. He made sure his men were well-fed, well-clothed, and equipped with the best weapons available. His supply lines were meticulously planned and heavily guarded. Unlike St. Clair, Wayne would not allow his army to be starved into submission. In 1793, Wayne moved the Legion down the Ohio River to a camp he named Hobson's Choice, near Fort Washington. His advance into the Ohio country was not a hasty rush, but a slow, deliberate, and inexorable crawl. He moved methodically, building a chain of forts as he went, including Fort Greenville and Fort Recovery, which he defiantly constructed on the very ground where St. Clair's army had been annihilated. Each fort was a bastion, a supply depot, and a clear statement of American intent. The Republic was not retreating, it was advancing, and this time it was coming for keeps. The Native American scouts watched this new army with growing alarm. This was not the disorganized mob they had slaughtered 2 years earlier. This was something new, something disciplined and dangerous. The Legion of the United States, an instrument of national vengeance forged in the fires of humiliation, was now poised to deliver the final decisive blow in the long and bloody war for the Ohio. The methodical advance of Anthony Wayne's Legion of the United States placed the Western Confederacy in an impossible position. For 2 years they had raided and skirmished, but they had avoided a decisive, large-scale engagement. Little Turtle, his caution now amplified, watched Wayne's relentless progress and knew that his earlier fears were being realized. He argued strongly against seeking a major battle. "We have beaten the enemy twice under separate commanders," he reportedly told the other chiefs. "We cannot expect the same good fortune always to attend us. The Americans are now led by a chief who never sleeps, and if we go into battle with him, we shall be defeated." His advice, once again, was rejected. The more aggressive chiefs, led by Blue Jacket, felt immense pressure to act. Wayne's army was burning their villages and cornfields, systematically destroying their ability to sustain themselves. Their British allies at Fort Miami whispered encouragement, implying they would support the warriors in a confrontation. Buoyed by false hope and their own pride, the Confederacy's leaders chose to fight. They gathered a force of some 1,500 warriors and chose their ground carefully, a tangled area near the Maumee River. where a recent tornado had strewn the landscape with a chaotic maze of fallen trees. This fallen timbers seemed a perfect spot for an ambush, a place where the legion's cavalry and disciplined formations would be neutralized. On August 20th, 1794, Wayne advanced on the native position. He knew their tactics. He knew they would fast for a day before battle to be spiritually pure. Using this knowledge, he feigned an attack one day and then delayed his real assault until the next, ensuring his opponents would be weak from hunger. When the Legion finally did attack, it was not with the clumsy head-on charges of St. Clair's army. Wayne deployed his men with brilliant tactical skill. His front line advanced into the tangled wood, drawing the warriors out from their cover. Then he unleashed his dragoons on the enemy's flank, a thundering cavalry charge that swept around the fallen trees and crashed into the side of the native line. The shock was devastating. The warriors, who had never faced a disciplined cavalry charge, were thrown into confusion. At the same time, the Legion infantry, drilled to perfection, fired a powerful volley and charged with bayonets fixed. The battle, which the Confederacy had hoped would be a repeat of their great victory, was over in less than an hour. The united warrior force broke and fled. Their resistance was shattered. The final bitter blow came as the retreating warriors fell back to the nearby British Fort Miami, expecting the gates to be opened to them as allies. The British commander, under strict orders to avoid direct conflict with the Americans, refused them entry. He locked the gates, leaving his erstwhile allies to their fate at the hands of Wayne's victorious Legion. The betrayal was absolute, a moment of stark clarity that exposed the hollowness of British promises. The defeat at Fallen Timbers, followed by this act of British treachery, broke the back of the Western Indian Confederacy. Wayne's Legion spent the next days systematically destroying every native village and cornfield in the Maumee Valley, eliminating any possibility of continued resistance. A year later, in August of 1795, the chiefs of the defeated tribes gathered with General Wayne at Fort Greenville. They had no choice but to sign the Treaty of Greenville. By its terms, they ceded almost all of the territory of modern-day Ohio, along with parts of Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. The dream of the Ohio River as a permanent boundary was dead forever. The river of blood had been crossed, and the United States claim was now sealed by conquest. And what of the Battle of the Thousand Slain, the great victory on the Wabash? It became a shameful and inconvenient memory for the United States, a story quickly buried in the national consciousness. History, after all, is written by the victors. The narrative of westward expansion was one of manifest destiny, of inevitable and righteous triumph. A defeat so total, so humiliating, at the hands of a people deemed primitive, did not fit that narrative. St. Clair's defeat became a footnote, a minor setback on the glorious march of progress, while Wayne's victory at Fallen Timbers was celebrated as the decisive event that pacified the frontier. Yet the truth is more complex and far more interesting. The forgotten battle was, in fact, the most important one. It was the catastrophic failure on the Wabash that forced the young republic to abandon its amateurish military ideals, to confront its own incompetence, and to forge the professional legion of the United States. It was the greatest victory of Native Americans that directly led to the creation of the very instrument of their final defeat. The lesson was learned in blood and humiliation. To become a continental power, the United States had to first become a true military power. The road to empire began not with a victory, but with the nation's most profound and purposefully forgotten defeat. The victors write the history books, carefully curating the past to construct a myth of their own inevitable greatness. Humiliating defeats like the slaughter on the Wabash are often erased or minimized, lest they tarnish the shining narrative of triumph. St. Clair's catastrophe was one such inconvenient truth, buried so that the comforting story of an unstoppable nation could be told. This leaves us with a fundamental question about how we remember our past. What serves a nation better in the long run? Is it the uncomfortable, unvarnished truth with all its lessons of failure, arrogance, and hubris? Or is it the comforting, inspiring myth of infallibility that builds national pride but risks repeating the mistakes of the past. Tell us your choice in the comments, and in doing so, help us understand who we truly are today.